now I know it's working. So. All right. Well, what I'd like to do today is talk about we call them the 7 eras of United States Indian policy. So, rather than taking it as a sort of a historical approach in the course, which I actually want to do, I'm going to give you kind of a quick and dirty run through today to give you some highlights of these periods before we get into each one of them in a little bit more detail. And that's pretty much going to be the rest of the unit up until the first exam. So first exam is on Thursday, the 26th of September. And so right about 2 weeks from Thursday. And like I do intend to have some quizzes for you, and you'll have some practices, some practice quizzes on that. So, but I'd like to just kind of provide kind of a framework for what you can expect for the rest of the periods. And we'll probably cover a couple of these eras. Probably cover a couple of eras at a time, except when they're really important, like they're really big, like that one, and maybe that one. So the first era, and this is, notice that we're beginning with the United States as an independent state, and not with the colonial governments. Just keep in mind that it was the British Crown, or the sovereign, that had the authority to deal with the Indian tribes prior to American independence. And the way that generally worked was when there was a treaty, when there was some sort of sovereign-to-sovereign relationship prior to 1778, it was usually conducted between the representatives of the king in a colony. So this is why some states have pre-independence, they have colonial era treaties with Indian tribes. South Carolina is a great example. So in South Carolina, what you would have is a delegation of the British represented as colonial officials. Typically, these were the people who were working for the governor of the colony. And the governor of the colony was answered to the British Crown, while each of the colonies, like South Carolina as an example, had a colonial assembly. The colonial assembly was made up of representatives of the settlers in the colony. They really didn't have much authority over Indian affairs prior to the United States. And this was one of the, of course, this is one of the big complaints that colonials had, was that it was, all the relationships, all of the official stuff that took place between the Indians and the British had to go through the king. And it was not something that the colonials had much say in. So after independence, the United States would inherit that sovereign-to-sovereign relationship. Okay, so that's where I like to begin. The first period of the United States Indian relations is, and these dates are pretty arbitrary. The reading that I have for you out of Canby will not be very precise on the dates, and I don't really intend for the dates to be that important, but there are some watershed dates, and I'll point those out to you on this. So, but 1778 is kind of a watershed. What's that begin with? I mean, 1776 is when we declare our independence, right? So what's 1778? 1778 is the first treaty between the new United States and an Indian tribe. This is the Delaware Treaty. So the very first treaty is 1778. And then the watershed date that we take this to is what, 1830? we have a relationship between the new United States and an Indian tribe, and we will have more. There are quite a few treaties between 1778 and 1830. But in 1830, you have a statute law passed called the Indian Removal Act. Indian Removal Act was really significant, so that would end this period of sovereign to sovereign relations, in the sense that the United States Congress, and in particular the President, was pushing this bill. This would force Native peoples to remove out of their homelands. Now, that's pretty common knowledge. It sounds like the Indian Removal Act is a law to remove Indians, right? But really, the Indian Removal Act didn't actually remove any Indians. It was merely an authorization bill to allow Congress to negotiate, or representatives of Congress to negotiate with officials in Indian tribes in order to gain cessions of land through treaties. Okay, so it was the Indian Removal Act is your typical freshman college history text. It talks about how the Indian Removal Act was this thing that wedged up Native peoples, but what it did was it just gave authorization to the U.S. government to establish treaties and gain land cessions from each tribe. All of the tribes that would eventually remove in the wake of the Indian Removal Act would do so with individual treaties. The Cherokees, for example, and the Cherokee Removal Treaty. Anybody know the name of it? Probably some Cherokees in here. The Cherokee Removal Treaty was signed in 1835, and it was referred to as the Treaty of New Echota. Echota was the more important settlement in northwest Georgia. And that treaty, of course, was considered to be somewhat illegal by the majority of the Cherokee Nation. So the treaty itself, and most of the treaties would wind up being signed by a particular faction of the tribe, right? And that was, of course, advantageous for the United States. But the treaty period, or this period when removal treaties began to be signed and established, and of course it wasn't really the very first removal treaty. The first removal treaties, as we'll see when we get into this, actually got started in the Articles of Confederation period. So we'll have some really important treaties that will actually kind of set the precedent for how things are worked out. And these would be treaties of cession, and you might really they're not really so much removal treaties, but they are treaties that establish boundaries and declare Indian country and that sort of thing. So we would have some precedents leading up to the Indian Removal Act. But just keep in mind, the Indian Removal Act didn't remove any particular tribe at all. It only authorized Congress to do so, and to do so in a formal way. So Andrew Jackson is always villainized for pushing the Indian Removal Act, because he was pushing it for a long time. He was using it to get elected, and it eventually worked for him, but it took him a while, all through the 1820s. And in the period when Jackson was promoting Indian removal is when the Cherokees and the Creeks and the Choctaws, they were all listening, and they established their own constitution. The Cherokees wrote their own constitution, got their own judiciary and their own legislature together, and so they conformed in the way that they assumed they were supposed to. They did everything they possibly could in order to fit within the United States federal system. Yet, and the Chief Justice John Marshall, as you know, in Worcester versus Georgia, came down on the side of the Cherokees that they had the right to, to be there, and that Georgia didn't have authority over them. Yet the executive branch ignored the judiciary, ignored John Marshall, and they forced the removal treaties that were eventually written. So anyway, that's there's a lot of dynamics taking place within this half century or so that we're looking at, and but it would be quite formative. So anyway, then we have this period that relatively short period we call removal, and this is for the most part focused on the removal of the southeastern tribes and the 5 civilized tribes, but also tribes out of the Middle West and even into the prairie areas that would be settled by the Homestead Act later. So the 1830 is, just to give you some parameters here, the 1830 is the Indian Removal Act. 1871 is also kind of a watershed year. That's the year that Congress ended the treaty process with Indian tribes. So 1871, no more treaties with the Indians. They no longer warrant a sovereign-to-sovereign relationship, okay? So removal, they're entirely dependent, essentially. Now, during the 1860s, the late 1860s, after the Civil War, and in the early 1870s is when you have the Indian Wars on the Great Plains. It's also the period when the bison, the American bison, are being exterminated, which was really the key to controlling and pacifying the Plains Indians, because without the buffalo, they were without their, it would be like cutting off petroleum to the United States. Right? So they were basically controlled by eliminating their resource base. So the Indian Wars of the 1870s, there were a lot of different treaties and removals during this period. Most of the treaties of cession would take place here. Okay, and then we have between 1871, no more treaties. We would have a period of Indian wars on the plains, and this is the period when you have reservations established for, more or less the tribes who went peacefully, and then you had the holdouts, the people who did not want to go peacefully and would not be subjugated without a fight. And that's mostly focused on the Great Plains, but also in the Southwest and also in the Pacific Northwest with Nez Perce, a few others. But the Plains tribes and the Southwestern tribes, the Apaches under Geronimo and a number of other smaller groups in the Southwest would basically fight against removal. At the same time, this is a period when reservations are really being established, and when the United States Indian Office is growing in size and becoming a fairly sizable bureaucracy tasked with this newly dependent population. So this is a period of warfare, of forced pacification, and establishing of reservations, and would initially be run by the Indian Office would become very militarized, and then the military, the role of the military would change over and be given by the federal government over to religious societies, what we might call religious or humanitarian groups. Okay, might sound like a good thing, but not necessarily. Not necessarily for the Indians. This was this changeover from military to sort of humanitarian groups is associated with President Grant, U.S. Grant, Ulysses Grant. And he referred to this as the peace policy. So we have the peace policy taking effect. When the military was in charge of rounding up Native peoples who were militant and bringing them to the reservations and keeping them dependent on United States government food rations and so forth. And the United States, the Army then said, we need to get out of this business, we need to hand this over to the humanitarians. So they handed it over to various religious groups. So this is a period on the reservation where you have a changeover from, it's kind of like handing control, I guess you could make an analogy in somewhere like Afghanistan where you have, okay, well the military is done, it's time for the civilians to take over, so here you go. And then things get worse, right? So anyway, we have a lot of different religious groups very active on Indian reservations. They wind up communicating the conditions of reservations to the rest of the American public. And by 1887, reformers, humanitarian reformers, have gained enough clout and gained enough political leverage that they began to criticize, well, even earlier than 1887, but during the early 1880s, they were very critical of the reservation system, they're critical of the United States government, and critical of the whole reservation policy. So reformers, particularly New England reformers, were very critical of the whole removal and reservation system. They preceded the Civil War in being critical of removal. In fact, Samuel Worcester, remember we've talked a lot about him, he was a New England missionary who was doing his very best to keep states' rights people, especially in Georgia, from overrunning the Cherokee Nation. So they were actually there early on. These are the same sort of people who would become the abolitionists. Okay, abolitionism was a reform approach to eliminate slavery. These are activists. These were people who were socially conscious. They were most of them had strong religious convictions. They were anti-slavery and they were anti-Indian removal. Mostly based in New England, not all of them, but mostly in New England. So these are people that are mostly coming out of the congregational. Originally they were originally Puritans, but the Puritans sort of disassembled and became Congregationalists. And of course, there were a lot of different religious changeovers and that sort of thing, and changes in the country's culture. But New England reformers would drive the criticism of the reservation policy. In fact, a lot of them worked on these reservations, so they saw it firsthand, and they communicated with one another about it. And they realized that Native peoples, and they were very vocal about the plight of Native peoples on reservations and how cruel it was for them to be rounded up and forced to live off government food rations because they could no longer hunt, they could no longer have their own economy. And so they became a very important force in trying to make conditions better for Native peoples on reservations. They did that by starting schools, churches, of course, Christianization. They tried their best to establish civilization, what they understood as civilization. Try to bring social change and betterment to Native peoples living on reservations, surviving on reservations. So this era between removal and Indian wars, forced removal, transitioned into a period of trying to do something good for the Native peoples, to try to get them to integrate into American society. And so the people who had, been the same group of people who had been behind the abolition movement to free slaves, also a lot of them actually had been abolitionists, and and after the war they picked up a new cause, and this cause was the plight of the American Indians in the West. So the civilization program was largely a matter of voluntary associations, religious groups, not the government so much, but the government gave them the green light to promote civilization, however we can say that. In social science terms, we would say acculturation or assimilation to the mainstream society. So assimilation is both the policy of the government, but it's they've allowed these non-governmental, I guess we call them NGOs today, the non-governmental organizations and religious organizations to sort of do the groundwork and do the dirty work. So this included things like, forcing people to learn English and telling them not allowing them to speak their own language. So languages were lost. Farming, subsistence farming instead of hunting bison, and other things like, were pushed. Ideas like, well, okay, a Western mindset rather than a Plains mindset. The idea that warfare is something that governments do, not something that groups of male family members do against other groups. So raiding and that sort of thing, which was always part of American Indian, or especially Plains society, raiding for horses or raiding for captives or whatever, which was part of their lifestyle, part of their way of gaining social status through warfare or whatever, were suppressed. Okay, so you have this, really, and not only that, but the women in Plains Indian societies who were considered to be really, really oppressed people, because they had a hard life. They really did, prior to being rounded up on reservations. The women in these military, for the most part, paternal sort of societies, military societies tend to be run by males, by the way, and small egalitarian males societies. The women in the Plains were responsible for raising the kids, cooking, but also things like processing bison hides for the hide trade. So they were working their tails off all the time, and on the reservation, and women also farmed. So on the reservation, the reformers often viewed the role of the men. They often saw the men being lazy and sort of good for nothing and doing nothing but wanting to. Since they couldn't hunt, then they would just stay drunk all the time and fight, gamble, whatever, gamble a lot. And the women they viewed pretty oppressed. So what would happen is women's status was kind of elevated once the Westerners had a lot of interaction with people on reservations, and the males, their road to status, their traditional road to status eliminated because that was considered uncivilized behavior, and they were, they really lost out big time. So, I'm not explaining it in a very good way, but for the most part, this period of 1887 to 1934 was a period of, it was a period of the assimilation program, and the ultimate activity of this period focused on eliminating the reservation altogether, because what happened was these reformers, and perhaps some people in the government, but particularly these New England reformers, who were very much believers in the market economy and what we call sort of classical liberal ideas of making it your very Protestant sort of mindset of hard work will get you ahead, and this is, everybody has the same opportunity and so forth. This sort of classical liberal attitude was very critical of the whole reservation setup. And because a reservation, by the way, was essentially a large chunk of land with boundaries around it, and then the native peoples were just kind of let loose like cattle there in order to make their way. And of course, what would happen was you would have an Indian agency or something, and basically the entire population would basically cluster around that Indian agency, because that's where food was. That's where all the government rations were coming from, and that's where if anybody wanted consumer goods, you had to be there. That's the trading post, and that's basically what would happen. You'd have the Indian agency would be the place where everybody settled, and the rest of the land was largely unused. There wasn't, early on, reservation Indians were even confined to the reservation itself. That to leave the reservation required getting a pass from the Indian agent. So it was very much a system that kept people dependent, and largely intentionally dependent, in order to control their behavior and their claims to land. But the reservation itself was communal land. Native peoples didn't have individual property. And this is what the reformers, largely these New England reformers, who were completely entrusting of a market economy, they said, well, this is obviously the problem. Native peoples, Indians, are living on these reservations. None of them have any property. None of them have any individual incentive to make a living, even though they could go out and farm. There's no way for them to do so because they can't own private property. And so that created a movement for allotment, what's referred to as allotment. Allotment is the division of the reservation into individual land holdings and turning over those land holdings to individual Indian people. And it was considered the necessary thing if you were going to convince Native peoples to become farmers like 90% of the rest of the Americans. Not that Indians never farmed, okay, but it was something, it was considered, well, there's probably, it kind of makes sense that Native peoples on reservations wouldn't farm because they don't have a sense of property, and they don't have a sense of capitalization, and they don't have a long-term sense of making a profit and establishing property. So the very basic thing was we need to reform the reservation. We need to take that reservation and we need to give each individual Indian some of his own land so that he can become like the rest of these Americans, especially this is during the Homestead Act, right? So in 1887, the Homestead Act had been going on for 15 years. And you know, tens of thousands of Americans had gained homesteads in the Midwest and the Great Plains. And it was driving development. And so these reformers said, well, let's get the native peoples in on that same sort of thing. We'll just divide up some of their reservation land. And of course, you know, the other side of that is that if you have a population of people that's, you know, has this large chunk of land, then you assign them 160 acres apiece, or even 80 acres apiece if they're women, or 40 acres maybe for kids. If you assign all the native peoples on this reservation their own farm, their own plot of land, then you're going to wind up establishing them on about 10%, perhaps, of the entire reservation, which opens the rest of the reservation up to use. So 90% of the land is opened up for settlement by non-Indians, okay? And that was, of course, a driving force in the allotment era. The allotment era would continue on. Most of the allotments would be made by about the time of World War I. When World War I broke out in 1914, most of the allotments had already been made, and allotments had been established. We'll talk more about the whole allotment system in great detail. You'll be very, very tired of it. But anyway, it's really important. So what I do is we stop with the allotment, and assimilation would continue on. We'll talk more about the Indian boarding school programs. If you've had much American history covering American Indians, you probably can't think of any good thing about the boarding school experience for Native peoples, but I'm going to actually give you some examples that were actually different. Not that the historians got it wrong, but there are some exceptions. And one of them is actually in Oklahoma. So allotment and assimilation is this era that is attempting to eliminate the communal land holding of Native peoples and give them private property. It's allotment. And it's also attempting to bring them into American society as part of American society, so that they can learn to live within the United States and be contributing members of society rather than prisoners on a reservation. So allotment and assimilation ends in 1934. This is a 180-degree shift. So we have an attempt to eliminate native tribes, eliminate what's referred to as tribalism, okay? And in large part, the elimination of reservations would do a lot of that. It certainly would eliminate the land base of native tribes, of American Indian tribes. The land base then would be the elimination of the land base, allotment, and the attempted elimination of Indian culture, which was part of this assimilation period, would change almost overnight once FDR is elected. So in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected. He takes the reins in 1933 and establishes the New Deal later that year. But in 1934 is when United States Indian policy under Roosevelt would change 180 degrees. And this is largely because of one individual in the federal government. And the way this worked was, by this time, the Office of Indian Affairs would become the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it was an agency within the Department of the Interior. Well, Roosevelt appointed a Secretary of the Interior by the name of Harold Ickes. You don't need to remember him so much. But Ickes hired an anthropologist, sociologist guy by the name of John Collier. If there's anybody more influential in United States Indian policy than John Marshall, it's John Collier. Okay? John Collier was appointed head of the Indian Office, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and would run the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the next 10 years or so, less than that. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about Collier. And we'll talk more about him, but Collier was originally from Atlanta, Georgia. He was a fairly wealthy young guy, wound up going to college back east, and then eventually actually went to Europe for a while and became fairly intrigued with socialism in Europe. This is, prior to the outbreak of World War II. But when socialism had still quite a lot of clout, particularly in places like France, where he studied. But anyway, he came back and he was very much an academic type, sociologist, anthropologist type. He went to the Pueblo area of New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and lived for about a year, and was very much influenced by the way of life of the Pueblo Indians, and considered he considered their way of life to be sort of a natural communism, a natural way of life that devalued material goods and valued family over material goods. And he was very, very, very influenced by that year in New Mexico. John Collier then, once the Depression took off, once the stock market crashed and then the banks started failing and the Federal Reserve System failed, and the Depression hit hard in 1933 or so, 32, 33. Collier began to see that he was very much a critic of capitalism, and he viewed this as the sort of natural evolution of the United States from a laissez-faire economy to what Marx was predicting, to be a workers' paradise, the communist revolution in the United States. So Collier was very much a socialist. He was, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to put native tribal governments. He wanted to revive tribal governments and allow tribal governments to demonstrate American Indian culture to the rest of the United States. So, rather than reformers trying to teach Indians to be Americans, right, to be capitalist Americans, John Collier wants the natural communist American Indian tribes to serve as an example for the rest of the Americans who are now on their knees during the Depression. Okay, so Collier then is appointed by Ickes. Ickes didn't like him, but he was. The thing about Collier was he was, for years prior to 1934, before getting appointed to this, he was a very outspoken critic of the Indian policy of the United States, particularly of the allotment policy and the boarding school policy. He was absolutely against forcing native peoples to give up their languages, to teach them trades and that sort of thing, and try to make them into farmers. He really hated that. And so when he got into office, the first thing he did was he said, okay, we're gonna revive these tribes. We're gonna let those tribes come back, and we're gonna do our best to have them establish themselves as legitimate governments. So John Collier was really the key. And the piece of legislation, a couple of important pieces of legislation during this period, was the Wheeler-Howard Act, otherwise known as the Indian, I want to say the Indian New Deal, which is kind of the slang version, but Indian Reorganization Act, right? Indian Reorganization Act, or IRA. Now, the IRA could also refer to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, but for the most part, we're going to refer to the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And what this did was it established a system to allow Indian tribal governments to sort of resurrect themselves. So all of the different Indian tribes that still existed, there was a population on a reservation somewhere, they were provided a sort of a template for writing up a new constitution, if they ever had one, writing a constitution for their tribe, establishing bylaws, and establishing a tribal government. Remember, socialists and New Dealers loved government. They believed government was beneficiary, government was benevolent, and government was the answer to the problems that the United States was experiencing in the early 1930s. They really, in the New Dealers in particular, you know, the very first New Dealers were, most of them were socialists, outright socialists. But they were vetted a little bit, and after 1933, the New Dealers got a little tamer. They were not quite as radical as they were initially. Still, they established a lot of programs that were intended to really change the United States, really change society. They created agencies such as the Tennessee Valley Authority. Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, was kind of one of the showcase agencies of the New Deal era. The idea that you would take an entire region, Appalachia, particularly southern Appalachia, southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, in East Tennessee, western North Carolina, western South Carolina, this region that had been impoverished forever. And the idea was that if you built dams, then you could establish hydroelectric power, and if you establish hydroelectric power, you could establish industries, and you could subsidize industries to get started there, which would bring people out of the hills. You'd allow them to have industrial types of jobs, and you would have consumer demand growing, and so this would get things going. They also had, in the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, also did things like reclamation of land. So southern Appalachia was pretty cut over for timber and had all types of soil erosion problems. So the TVA was considered to be this grand plan to demonstrate to the United States, to the people of America, that government planning could solve their problems. This is the New Deal attitude. Government is good, government is benevolent, government will fix things, and in the process, get rid of this laissez-faire, classical liberal attitude about markets and so forth. So the New Deal was really, really significant, and just part of that is the Indian Reorganization Act, with Collier viewing Native peoples as sort of natural-born communists living in their own cultural utopias. All right, so he wanted them to get revived so that the rest of America could learn from them. Well, as you know, The New Deal was entirely 120% successful, right? Put America back to work and changed everything for the better. I'm just kidding. What happened? The United States went back to work in the late 1930s, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't we? Yeah?
Yeah.
1938, 37, 38. Why?
Because of World War II?
Because of a massive military buildup, because the Germans were going crazy in Europe. The Nazis were expanding. The United States embarked on a gargantuan military mobilization and buildup. Industry was busy overnight. Yeah, it was all on credit, but for the most part, there was work to be done. And what happened to all those New Deal agencies? Did they just say, well, our job is done, we're no longer needed? Did they close shop and say, well, we'll go off and find other things? No. Government never does that. Government always sticks around until it's absolutely eradicated by somebody else, right? So all of these big, massive agencies that got started in the 1930s would continue to exist, including the Bureau of Indian Affairs, including the TVA, which still exists for some strange reason. But anyway, the New Deal basically bloated the federal government, all right? It bloated the federal government big time, and it's been bloated ever since. So the Indian New Deal, though, was significant because it actually allowed those, government is good, so we need tribal governments. So the tribal governments revived. Many of them did, not all of them. A lot of tribes said, no, we don't want to do that. We're okay, all right? We don't need a constitution, and we don't need to have a tribal council, and we don't need to have a chief. So a lot of them just ignored that, to Collier's chagrin. Well, anyway, a lot of them did. A lot of them got revamped because, of course, there was a lot of incentive from the federal government to do these sorts of things. People aren't stupid. They realize that, well, if they're giving us an incentive to establish a government, there must be something in it. So we'll do that. And that's when we begin to have this tribal federal government support. So we have this tribal government gets revived, and then what happens? Well, the Democrats, for the most part, fizzle out, right? And the 1950s is an era of massive economic growth after World War II. The post-war boom era. Eisenhower is president, and there is, of course, the McCarthy era, right? Where we have the latest Red Scare and the sort of accusations about communism, and we're into the Cold War. Okay, so very, very different from the 1930s. Embracing socialism over here, and in the 1950s, attempts to eradicate the left and suspected communists from the United States. So this is another 180-degree turn for the most part. During the 1950s, especially from 1953, and that's a watershed date. For what reason? Anybody guess? So we got the Indian Reorganization Act 1934, and then we've got this is the date of Public Law 280, and we'll talk a lot about PL 280. This is one of several steps, probably the most significant step, to place Indian country under the authority of state governments. It proved to be, for the most part, a disaster for those states that took the initiative to extend their legal authority, their jurisdiction over Indian country. Most of them eventually folded and said, we don't want this anymore, okay? PL 280. But what this was really significant, because what happens when you get these, you have Indian tribes established in the 1930s, and then by the 1950s, the government's trying to disestablish them. They're trying to break them up again, right? So that, you can imagine being a tribal member, it's like, you know, come on, stick with the program one way or the other. You know, you're just confusing us. So anyway, this is the period that's known generally as, it's not really long, but the 1950s is referred to often as the Termination and Relocation era. That's actually the title of a book by a very good book on the subject of termination. Relocation refers to a government program, a termination era government program that was very similar to the allotment idea, in that, anybody ever heard of the relocation program? The federal relocation program, it sounds like, you know, the witness relocation program. It's not like that. What this did was, this was a program that set up a system so that men, mostly men, living in rural areas of reservations or former reservations, you know, take, for example, let's say Caddo County, Oklahoma. So you have some Kiowa guy living in Caddo County around Carnegie or somewhere. The relocation program would do this. It would say, okay, you're out here, you're jobless, or you're not making a lot of money. Here's an incentive program. We will send you to Los Angeles, set you up with a job in the Chevrolet factory in Southern California, or the Boeing factory or something like that. We'll set you up with this factory job. We'll get you an apartment so that you can live there. You don't have to have any, you know, family connections to get there. We'll actually take you in, you know, government transportation to this new location. You'll get set up, and you'll be a citizen of Los Angeles, and you'll have a job in a, you know, airplane parts factory or something. Okay, so this was just a way to try to get Native men, particularly, out of rural areas, you know, reservation or former reservation areas, and get them integrated into urban society, modern urban society. Okay? And a lot of them took advantage of it. And they moved to places like San Francisco and Minneapolis. You know. And the weird thing about it was, well, it was not weird. The government's approach to this was, okay, if you were living in Carnegie, Oklahoma, what would be the most logical place to relocate you? Maybe Dallas or Houston, where there's industrial jobs, or maybe Oklahoma City, right? Yeah, but no, that's not what they did. They relocated them usually as far as they could, so people in Oklahoma would often wind up in San Francisco, right? I think I mentioned that Wilma Mankiller, right? Wilma Mankiller grew up in San Francisco. Her family, I guess, was part of that relocation program. This moved a lot of Native peoples to different large cities, and this is during the 1950s and so this is when you begin to have the emergence of what we call an urban Indian population. And it's not like comparatively speaking, it's pretty small in terms of numbers of people. But by the way, here at OSU, if any of you have a chance, if you take a class from Professor Doug Miller in the history department, this is his specialty, is urban Indians. Just thought I'd plug him for a second. Anyway, it had other ramifications. By moving Native peoples into the cities and to a degree integrating them into American society, a lot of these people became pretty vocal. A lot of these people got involved in the civil rights movement, right? So the civil rights movement, of course, was emerging in the mid 1950s, and of course, how did the civil rights movement essentially get started anyway? Who were the first people to really begin to challenge metropolitan and state government and segregation?
What do you mean?
They weren't academics, I'll say that.
Something like certain people?
Yeah, well, what walk of life did they come from? Who were they educated folks? Okay, who were they? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, if you look at some of the early academic drivers of the civil rights movement, yeah, a lot of them were academics from New York City and that sort of thing. But there were a lot of veterans, a lot of African American veteran men who had fought in World War II and came back to, being considered second-class citizens after having been, for the most part, integrated in the military and fighting for the country. They didn't put up with a lot of this crap. They weren't going to come back to Jim Crow. So a lot of these early civil rights folk, or the early movers of the civil rights movement, had fought in World War II. So anyway, the reason I mention that is because a lot of American Indian men fought in World War II as well, and a lot of other wars, and they were veterans who came back and they said, okay, we're expected to live in this impoverished area in South Dakota. Where they wound up going to large cities and getting plugged into the movements that would eventually be called the civil rights movement. So in the 1960s, you have this emergence of the civil rights movement dominated by African Americans, but you also have kind of offshoots. Of course, one of those offshoots would be, the sexual revolution of, homosexuals, and then another part of that, another offshoot of the civil rights movement, it would be the American Indian counterpart to the Black Panthers, the American Indian movement. Okay. And the American Indian movement were radicalized Native peoples, mostly from the plains, but they were involved in trying to get federal policy changed so that Native peoples had more opportunities and more rights. Now, this is all taking place mostly in the 1960s, and there are a lot of events that take place, particularly Wounded Knee 2 and that sort of thing, that we should talk about when we get there. But what happens is, this era of the civil rights is dominated by the Great Society of LBJ. And I start this at I end this period of termination relocation in 1960 with the election of Kennedy. But of course, Kennedy is assassinated, and what happens is LBJ takes over, and Johnson's Great Society program, or Great Society, would, in many ways, pick up where Collier left off. Okay? So Johnson, and in particular Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, anybody know who that was? You guys ought to know that. Stuart Udall.
I was going to say.
You've heard of Udall scholars, right? he was a very strong advocate of American Indian sovereignty and civil rights. But anyway, the Great Society of the 1960s would sort of go back to the New Deal days and help revive those tribal governments that had been kind of persisting through the 1950s. Okay, so the Democrats were in charge in the 1960s for the most part. And so you have this, this sort of changing of attitude. Now, who was elected president in 1969?
Richard Nixon?
Sorry, 1968. Who takes office in 1969? Yeah. Richard Nixon. Right? What do you know about Richard Nixon?
Watergate.
Of course, Watergate.
Bombing Cambodia.
Bombing Cambodia. Actually, I think Johnson was in on that one too.
Yeah.
He's the one that stepped it up as well. But he, you know, the bombing of Cambodia was an attempt to try to end the war secretly.
And what, I mean, I could be wrong. Wasn't it the kitchen debate too? Part
Excuse
of that?
me?
The kitchen debate, was that a part of Nixon?
History major's throwing me here.
Was the kitchen
Yeah,
debate?
the kitchen cabinet, right? Is that what you're talking about? The kitchen cabinet?
The kitchen debate.
No, the kitchen. Okay, all right. We'll talk another time about that.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, I'm just trying to say, because you know, y'all are young and you don't remember Richard Nixon because he was gone long before you showed up. I remember Nixon, and but Nixon gets a lot of flack, all right? And he deserves a lot of flack. He deserves a lot of it. But one thing about Nixon was he was a Quaker, okay, at least outwardly. He was a Quaker, and he had a soft spot for Native Americans, okay? He believed a lot of the same things that people like Collier, maybe not the same way, but he agreed that Native peoples had gotten the shaft for centuries in the United States. Nixon, in a lot of ways, okay, Nixon was in no way a real conservative Republican. He was a very moderate Republican. Nixon was the president when the Environmental Protection Act was passed, Endangered Species Act was passed. He was very much an environmental, pro-environmental president. He did a lot of his domestic policies were actually very, very moderate and very generally accepted. And his foreign policy in China, of course, was laudable, but of course, yeah, he was involved with Watergate. All right, so anyway, that you'll never live that one down. But the thing about Nixon was he made a public statement, a statement to Congress, that American Indian tribes should no longer be subject to termination. Okay, and by termination, what we mean is the idea that American Indian tribes, once they're established, would be disestablished. And that's, there were quite a few tribes that actually got terminated. But what Nixon did was he changed the policy from an executive point of view. He made the official policy that there would be no more termination, so he ended the termination era and replaced it with what he referred to as the self-determination era. Self-determination. Oh, I guess I already wrote that. Gee, all right, pay attention to the board. Okay, the self-determination era, what did that mean? It meant that tribes would have a guarantee to exist, tribal governments could exist, and now he's a Republican, so what's he thinking? Nixon is thinking that tribes have a position in the United States government they have a strange sort of place. And that place is somewhere between the states and somewhere between the federal government. They're like states, but in other words, Nixon saw that tribes had some advantages. They had some advantages in that they could operate independently of the states in a lot of ways. So Nixon is thinking, well, let's let the tribes act as, corporations. Let's let tribes act as their own bodies, their own organizations. So this self-determination idea is all about jobs and establishing economic development in poor areas. What Nixon did see was that tribal peoples, native peoples, had intentionally been made dependent since the days of removal. They had been intentionally made dependent on the government. And what Nixon wanted to do is eliminate that dependency from the federal government. Now, did Collier want them to be eliminated from dependency? I think he probably, Collier's, if you look at what he did, he wanted to get all the claws in there. He wanted to have all kinds of government connections. What Nixon was promoting was, let's get the tribes to operate independently of the federal government. Let's allow them to do their own thing so that they're not dependent on federal handouts, so that they can do their own thing and act maybe as private corporations if they wish. And that's what Nixon got going. Now, what happened? I say Nixon was not a conservative. He wasn't. He increased spending, and so there were new programs to encourage American Indian tribes to attract industry to their reservation lands. So it was kind of an experiment, but there were programs that were established to allow Native American tribes to act in a way that was in their own best interests so that they could bring economic development to their own people. And the way that they would do that would be through their special political and legal status, which was outside of the purview of state regulation. So he's thinking like a Republican, okay? That you get the government out of it, things might be better. Of course, then in 1981, when Ronald Reagan comes to town, Ronald Reagan would continue Nixon's policy. He would say, okay, self-determination sounds fantastic. But of course, Reagan was all about, unlike Johnson and Roosevelt, government is the answer to everything. Reagan said, government is the problem, right? We need to get government out of it. And so during the 1980s, during the Reagan years, a lot of those programs that got started during Nixon and the Carter years in the 1970s were cut. Okay, so it's like, okay, we're going to help you learn how to swim, but now we're going to throw you in right here. So sink or swim at this point in the 1980s. Well, during the 1980s, of course, there were a lot of changes, a lot of cuts in spending, that sort of thing. But for the most part, this era has continued. And what we've seen is tribes that now are thriving more than ever, largely because of a niche, their political niche. Okay, and that's a lot of that political niche is all about their land. Their land is different. American Indian trust land is outside of the regulatory authority of states and allows them a degree of independence. So thank the Republicans, okay? Thank the Republicans for allowing American Indian tribes to actually do something on their own. We'll talk more about that next time. All right.